April 7th, 1945. A canvas medical tent in Germany, 15 miles east of the Rhine. Captain Robert Mitchell kneels beside a makeshift operating table, his hands covered in blood that isn't American. The woman on the table is dying. She knows it. He knows it. Her uniform, what's left of it, marks her as a German military nurse. 20 minutes ago, she was the enemy. Now she's a patient, bleeding out from shrapnel wounds that have torn through her abdomen and chest. Her eyes find his, clear despite the pain and shock. Her English is accented but precise. "Don't let them see me like this." She means the German prisoners outside the tent, the men she cared for, the soldiers who knew her as their angel of mercy. She doesn't want them to see her broken, dying, helpless on an American operating table. Mitchell understands. He's been a combat surgeon for 18 months. He's learned that dignity matters, sometimes more than life itself. He nods, gestures to his assistant, and a blanket goes up across the tent entrance. Whatever happens in the next hour will happen in private. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The United States Third Army had crossed the Rhine in late March, 1945. By April, they were driving deep into Germany, advancing faster than anyone had predicted. The German army was collapsing, not in organized retreat, but in chaotic fragments. Some units fought with desperate ferocity. Others surrendered en masse. The infrastructure of the Third Reich was disintegrating. Roads clogged with refugees. Cities burned. Military hospitals, overwhelmed with wounded, had nowhere to evacuate their patients. Captain Mitchell's medical detachment moved with the advance, setting up aid stations in captured towns, treating American casualties, and, increasingly, German prisoners who needed immediate care. The Geneva Convention was clear. Wounded prisoners received medical treatment. In practice, American medics prioritized their own casualties, then treated prisoners when time and supplies allowed. Mitchell followed that protocol without question. American soldiers came first, always. But he didn't refuse treatment to prisoners who would die without it. The town they'd captured that morning was called Hadamar. It sat in the hills north of Frankfurt, a small place that should have been medically insignificant. But intelligence had reported a German military hospital there, and the advance had been so rapid that the hospital hadn't evacuated. When American tanks rolled into Hadamar at dawn, they found the hospital still operating, still full of German wounded, still staffed by German doctors and nurses who had nowhere to run. Mitchell's detachment arrived 2 hours later. His orders were straightforward. Secure the German medical facility, assess their wounded, determine which prisoners needed immediate treatment, move the rest to proper POW camps. It should have been routine. The war was nearly over. Germany was finished. These final weeks were just mopping up, processing surrenders, managing the collapse. Mitchell walked into the German hospital, expecting to find demoralized staff and wounded soldiers grateful to be out of the fighting. Instead, he found a functioning medical unit still trying to save lives under impossible conditions. The German hospital occupied a 3-story building that had been a sanatorium before the war. The ground floor was surgery and critical care. The second and third floors were wards for recovering patients. The building had taken shell damage. Windows were blown out. Part of the roof was missing. But the German medical staff had kept working, treating wounded through the bombardment, through the American advance, through the collapse of everything around them. Mitchell introduced himself to the German chief surgeon, an older man named Dr. Klaus Hermann. They spoke in a mixture of English and German, both men keeping their tone professional, clinical. Hermann reported his situation. 68 wounded German soldiers, 14 critically injured. 3 operating rooms still functional. Adequate surgical supplies for perhaps 2 more days. No anesthesia remaining. No blood for transfusions. No antibiotics. His staff had been working for 36 hours straight. Mitchell made his assessment quickly. The critically wounded needed immediate care or they'd die. The rest could be stabilized and moved. He could use the German operating rooms, supplement their supplies from American stocks, and complete the urgent surgeries within 24 hours. Then they'd evacuate everyone who could be moved. The German staff would be processed as prisoners. The wounded would go to proper POW medical facilities. Hermann agreed. The alternative was watching his patients die. Mitchell set up his command in the German hospital's administrative office. His American team would handle surgery. The German nurses could assist, under supervision. The German doctors would be confined, but could provide consultation if needed. It was an arrangement born of necessity, not trust. The Germans were still the enemy, still prisoners, still potentially dangerous. But they had medical knowledge Mitchell might need, and their patients deserved treatment regardless of whose uniform they wore. He met the nursing staff that afternoon. 7 German military nurses, exhausted women who'd been caring for wounded soldiers, while shells fell and their nation collapsed around them. They stood at attention when Mitchell entered, professional despite their fatigue, waiting to learn their fate. He explained the arrangement through a translator. They would assist American medics. They would follow American orders. They would provide care to their own wounded under American supervision. Any resistance would result in immediate confinement. One nurse stood out. Oberschwester Anna Keller, Senior Sister Keller. She was 32 years old, according to her papers, a veteran of the Eastern Front and North Africa before being assigned to Germany. She'd been the hospital's head surgical nurse. She spoke some English. Her efficiency was obvious even in these chaotic circumstances. When Mitchell explained his plan, she asked precise questions about procedures, supply allocation, patient priorities. She wasn't challenging his authority. She was making sure she understood how to help her patients survive. Mitchell assigned her to work with his surgical team. She knew the German patients' conditions better than anyone. She could anticipate what each surgery would require. And she could keep the other German nurses functioning despite their exhaustion and fear. It was a practical decision based on medical necessity, but it meant Mitchell would spend the next 24 hours working closely with a German nurse who, a week earlier, had been supporting the Wehrmacht's defense against his advance. They began operating at 1400 hours. First case, a German corporal with a sucking chest wound. Mitchell opened him up while Keller assisted, her hands steady, her instrument passes precise. She'd done this hundreds of times before, in German field hospitals from Stalingrad to Tunisia to the Rhine. The nationality of the surgeon didn't matter. The procedure was the procedure. The soldier was her patient. Mitchell worked efficiently, repairing the damaged lung, inserting a chest tube, closing. 90 minutes. The corporal would live, would recover, would spend the rest of the war in a POW camp. Keller had helped save him without hesitation, without question, doing her job because that's what nurses did. Second case. Third case. Fourth. The afternoon became evening. They worked through the night. American coffee kept Mitchell awake. Keller seemed to run on pure will, her fatigue evident but her competence never wavering. Between surgeries, they barely spoke. There was nothing to say. They were professionals doing necessary work. The war would end eventually. Until then, wounded soldiers needed treatment, regardless of which side they fought for. At 0300 hours on April 7th, the shelling started. Not German artillery, American. Division artillery was pounding German positions 5 miles east. The hospital was well behind American lines, safely distant from the fighting. But modern artillery had long range, and trajectories weren't always precise. The first shell landed 200 yards from the hospital. The second, 100 yards. The third hit the hospital's east wing. Mitchell was between surgeries when the building shook. Dust fell from the ceiling. The lights flickered but stayed on. His surgical assistant ran to investigate. 30 seconds later, he returned. The east wing was hit. Part of the second floor collapsed. German patients from that ward were being evacuated to the ground floor. And there were wounded. Not from the original patient list. From the building collapse. Mitchell grabbed his aid bag and ran. The east wing was chaos. Beams had fallen. Masonry blocked corridors. German nurses were pulling patients from the rubble, searching for survivors. American guards were helping. regulations forgotten in the immediate crisis. Mitchell found 3 German soldiers trapped under debris, all wounded by the collapse. He directed their extraction, triaged their injuries. 2 could wait. 1 needed immediate surgery, a head injury that would kill him within hours without intervention. Then someone called for a doctor. Different voice, more urgent. Mitchell followed the sound to a section of collapsed ceiling. 2 German nurses were pulling aside broken beams. Underneath, another nurse. Oberschwester Keller. She'd been checking on patients in the ward when the shell hit. The ceiling came down directly above her. Mitchell pushed through and knelt beside her. She was conscious, breathing, but bleeding heavily. Shrapnel from the shell had penetrated the floor above and caught her when the ceiling collapsed. He could see at least 3 major wounds: abdomen, chest, left shoulder. She needed surgery immediately. Without it, she'd bleed out within the hour. His assistant was already setting up the portable litter. They'd move her to an operating room, start work immediately. But Keller grabbed Mitchell's wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong despite the blood loss and shock. Her English came through clearly. "Don't let them see me like this." Mitchell understood immediately. The German prisoners, the soldiers she'd cared for, the men who knew her as their nurse. She didn't want them to see her carried past them, broken and dying. She didn't want her last memory in their minds to be helplessness and failure. She'd maintained their dignity when they were wounded. She wanted that same dignity for herself. Mitchell made his decision in seconds. They'd use the administrative office. It was private, away from the wards. They could convert it to an impromptu operating room. His team could work there without an audience. Keller could maintain the professional distance she'd kept her entire career, even as she died. If she died. Mitchell wasn't planning on that. They carried her to the office on a litter, moving quickly but carefully. His surgical assistant was already converting a conference table into an operating surface. Another medic was gathering supplies, instruments, anesthesia, plasma. A third was rigging additional lights. The room wasn't sterile, wasn't ideal, but Mitchell had operated in far worse conditions. In hedgerows, in Normandy. In shell craters in the Ardennes. In the back of moving trucks during retreats. An office in a captured hospital was practically luxurious by comparison. Keller remained conscious as they positioned her on the table. She knew what her wounds meant. She'd seen enough casualties to understand the mathematics of blood loss and organ damage. She'd assisted in enough surgeries to know what Mitchell would have to do, and what her chances were. Her eyes met his one more time. "No fear. Just a question. Can you save me?" Mitchell didn't answer with words. He couldn't promise survival. Combat surgery was about percentages, not certainties. But he could promise effort. He nodded, squeezed her hand briefly, then stepped back to scrub. His assistant administered anesthesia. Keller's eyes closed. Her breathing steadied into the mechanical rhythm of sedation. Mitchell began. The first wound was in her left shoulder. Shrapnel had penetrated just below the clavicle, missing the subclavian artery by less than an inch. If it had hit the artery, she'd have bled out before they got her to the table. Mitchell extracted the fragment, repaired the damaged tissue, sutured carefully. 30 minutes. He moved to the chest wound. This one was more serious. A piece of concrete from the ceiling had broken off and driven into her right chest wall, penetrating between the ribs. It hadn't hit the lung, another piece of luck, but it had damaged intercostal vessels. Blood was filling the pleural space. Mitchell made his incision, evacuated the blood, found the damaged vessels, tied them off. He inserted a chest tube to drain remaining fluid and inflated the lung. 60 minutes total time. The abdominal wound was the worst. Shrapnel had entered just left of her navel, angled upward. Mitchell opened the abdomen carefully, knowing what he might find. The fragment had torn through the small intestine in 2 places, nicked the liver, and exited posteriorly. He could see the damage, assess the repairs needed. Intestinal resection. Liver repair. Extensive irrigation to prevent infection. This was going to take hours. His assistant monitored Keller's vital signs while Mitchell worked, blood pressure dropping, pulse thready. She was going into shock despite the plasma they'd given her. Mitchell worked faster, but not carelessly. Speed without precision killed patients. He resected the damaged sections of intestine, anastomosed the healthy ends, packed the liver wound, irrigated the peritoneal cavity repeatedly. 2 hours into the surgery, her heart rate began to climb. Early sign of hemorrhage somewhere he'd missed. Mitchell went back through his work, checking every vessel he'd tied, every suture he'd placed. There, a small bleeder in the mesentery, missed in the initial repair. He clamped it, sutured it, checked again. The heart rate stabilized. 3 hours. 4. The surgery became a test of endurance. Mitchell's concentration against Keller's declining physiology. She'd lost too much blood before they got her to the table. Her body was struggling to compensate. Modern medicine could only do so much. The rest was up to her constitution, her will to live, the random chance that separated survivors from casualties. Mitchell had seen stronger men die from lesser wounds. He'd also seen people survive injuries that should have killed them. War had taught him that medicine was art as much as science. You did everything correctly, followed every protocol, made every right decision, and sometimes the patient died anyway. Other times, you did your best with impossible circumstances, and the patient survived against all odds. He didn't know which this would be. At 0700 hours, as dawn light began filtering through the broken windows, Mitchell placed his final suture. The surgery was complete. He'd done everything he could do. Keller's abdomen was closed, drains in place, dressings applied. Her vital signs were weak but stable. She was alive. Whether she'd stay alive was another question. Mitchell's assistant would monitor her while he scrubbed out and checked on the other casualties from the collapse. The German soldier with the head injury had been treated by another American surgeon. He'd survive. The other wounded from the building collapse were stabilized. The rest of the German patients were being prepared for evacuation to a proper POW hospital facility. Dr. Hermann approached Mitchell in the corridor. The older German surgeon had been awake all night, confined to quarters, but aware of everything happening. He asked about Keller. Mitchell gave him a clinical summary. Extensive injuries, successful surgery, prognosis uncertain. She'd need days of recovery before they'd know if she'd survive. Hermann's response was quiet. She's a good nurse. One of the best I've worked with. Not pleading for special treatment, just stating a fact. Acknowledging competence, the way one medical professional recognized another's skill. Mitchell understood. He'd seen Keller's work during their surgeries the previous day. She was indeed a good nurse, trained, experienced, dedicated. She'd spent years caring for wounded soldiers, German soldiers, doing her job under increasingly impossible conditions as Germany's war machine collapsed. Now she was the patient, her life dependent on an American surgeon who'd been her enemy a day earlier. The irony wasn't lost on Mitchell. He'd spent 18 months treating casualties created by German weapons. He'd operated on American soldiers torn apart by German artillery, machine guns, mines. He'd watched men die because German forces were trying to kill them. And now he'd just spent 4 hours saving a German nurse's life, using the same skills, the same care, the same dedication he brought to treating his own troops. War made strange demands. Mitchell returned to check on Keller at 0900 hours. She was still unconscious, still on the makeshift operating table in the administrative office. Her vital signs were marginally better. Blood pressure had stabilized. Heart rate was still elevated but steady. Respiratory effort was adequate. She was surviving the immediate post-operative period, which meant she had a chance. He sat in a chair beside the table, too tired to stand, too wired to sleep. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the night was fading, leaving exhaustion in its wake. He'd been operating for almost 20 hours straight, first on German casualties, then on collapse victims, then on Keller. His hands were steady, his mind clear, but his body was approaching its limits. His surgical assistant brought coffee. American coffee, strong and bitter, the fuel that kept combat surgeons functional through impossible schedules. Mitchell drank it gratefully, feeling the caffeine push back the exhaustion temporarily. Outside the office, the hospital was transitioning. German patients who could be moved were being loaded onto trucks for transport to POW facilities. The critically wounded who couldn't travel were being consolidated in the ground floor wards under American medical supervision. German medical staff were being processed as prisoners, though the nurses who'd assisted during the collapse were being allowed to continue caring for patients under guard. The war was continuing its strange transformation from combat to occupation. Yesterday, these German soldiers had been shooting at Americans. Today, they were prisoners receiving American medical care. Tomorrow, they'd be in POW camps, waiting for the war to end so they could go home. The fighting was becoming administration. The immediacy of survival replaced by the bureaucracy of managing thousands of prisoners who needed food, shelter, and medical treatment. But in the administrative office, the war was still immediate. Keller was still fighting for her life, her body struggling to recover from injuries that would have killed most people. Mitchell watched her breathe, counted her pulse, checked her dressings, clinical observations, medical routine, the familiar patterns of post-operative care. At 1100 hours, she began to wake. The anesthesia was wearing off. Her eyes opened, unfocused at first, then clearing. She saw Mitchell sitting beside her, saw the ceiling above her. Understood she was alive, was past the surgery, was in recovery. She tried to speak. Her throat was too dry. Mitchell's assistant brought water, helped her sip. Her voice came out as a whisper. "Did you—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Mitchell understood the question. "The surgery went well," he said. "You're stable. You'll need time to recover, but you should make it." Should, not will. Medical honesty. He couldn't promise survival, only that she'd survived this far. Keller nodded slightly. The movement cost her obvious effort. She was exhausted, in pain despite the medication, weak from blood loss and shock. But she was conscious, aware, herself. "Thank you," she whispered. Mitchell didn't know how to respond to that. He was an American officer. She was a German prisoner. He'd saved her life because that's what doctors did, not because of gratitude or friendship or anything beyond professional obligation. But she'd thanked him anyway, recognizing the effort, the hours of surgery, the skill that had kept her alive. "Rest," he said finally. "You've got a long recovery ahead." She closed her eyes. Whether from exhaustion or emotion, Mitchell couldn't tell. Within minutes, she was asleep again, her body demanding the rest it needed to heal. Mitchell stood, stretched, felt his back protest from hours of standing hunched over an operating table. He needed sleep. He needed food. He needed to check on his other patients and file reports and manage the evacuation and do all the other tasks that came with being a combat surgeon in an advancing army. But first, he needed to ensure Keller had proper post-operative care. He arranged for one of the German nurses to sit with her, supervised by an American medic. He left orders for monitoring vital signs, administering pain medication, changing dressings. He made it clear that Keller was to receive the same care as any American patient. Priority equal to their own casualties. His executive officer questioned that decision. Resources were limited. American casualties should get preference. Why was Mitchell allocating scarce medical personnel to monitor a German prisoner? Mitchell's answer was simple. "Because I just spent 4 hours saving her life. I'm not going to let her die from inadequate post-operative care." The officer didn't argue further. Mitchell had earned enough respect through 18 months of combat medicine that his medical decisions were rarely questioned. If he said a German prisoner needed intensive monitoring, then she got intensive monitoring. Mitchell finally slept at 1300 hours, collapsing on a cot in what had been the German hospital's staff quarters. He slept for 4 hours, dreamless and exhausted, his body shutting down completely. When he woke at 1700 hours, the first thing he did was check on Keller. She was awake again, more alert this time. The pain medication was working. Her vital signs had improved marginally. She was drinking water, tolerating small amounts of clear liquid. The German nurse attending her reported no complications, no signs of infection, no unexpected bleeding. Keller watched Mitchell check her wounds, examine her dressings, review her vital signs chart. She didn't speak until he'd finished his examination. "The others," she said. "The patients from the ward. Did they survive the collapse?" Mitchell had to think back through the chaos of the previous night. The German patients from the East Wing. Most had been evacuated successfully before the ceiling came down. A few had been injured in the collapse, but none seriously. They'd all survived. "They're fine," he told her, "being evacuated to a POW hospital." She nodded, satisfied. Even now, injured and weak, her concern was for her patients. That's what defined her, what had defined her throughout her service. Not the politics of the war, not the ideology of the regime she'd served, but the immediate duty to care for the wounded men placed in her charge. Mitchell understood that mindset. He felt the same way about his own casualties. The larger questions of why they were fighting, whether the war was just, what would happen after victory, all of that receded when faced with a wounded soldier who needed immediate care. You did your job. You saved who you could. You lived with the losses you couldn't prevent. And you didn't think too deeply about the morality of treating one wounded soldier while his comrades were trying to kill your comrades a few miles away. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Over the next 3 days, Keller's condition gradually improved. The immediate post-operative period was the most dangerous time, when infection or hemorrhage or organ failure could still kill despite successful surgery. But her body was fighting back, healing, recovering. Her vital signs strengthened, her pain decreased. She began eating solid food. By April 10th, she could sit up briefly without becoming dizzy. Mitchell checked on her twice daily, morning and evening rounds, the same attention he gave to his American patients. Her recovery was progressing normally. No complications, no setbacks. She was going to survive. The hospital was nearly empty now. Most German patients had been evacuated. The American wounded were being treated at forward aid stations closer to the rapidly advancing front. The Third Army was driving deeper into Germany, encountering less organized resistance as the Wehrmacht disintegrated. Towns were surrendering without fights. Entire divisions were giving up en masse. The war was ending, not with dramatic final battles, but with exhausted collapse. Germany was simply running out of everything it needed to continue fighting. Fuel, ammunition, food, replacement soldiers, the will to resist. The advance was becoming a race to accept surrenders and process prisoners faster than they accumulated. Mitchell's detachment received orders to move forward on April 11th. They'd pack up, leave a small rear element to handle remaining patients, and establish a new aid station 40 miles east. The war was passing them by. They needed to catch up. That meant deciding what to do with Keller. She couldn't be moved yet. The abdominal surgery had been too extensive. Moving her too soon risked rupturing sutures, causing internal bleeding, undoing everything Mitchell had accomplished. She needed at least another week of recovery before she could tolerate transport. But Mitchell couldn't stay. He had orders. His detachment was needed forward. American casualties required treatment. He couldn't delay an entire medical unit for one German prisoner, even one he'd personally operated on. The solution was a rear echelon hospital being established in Frankfurt. It would handle German prisoners who needed extended medical care. Keller would be transferred there once Mitchell's rear element certified she was stable enough for transport. She'd complete her recovery under German medical staff, supervised by American overseers. Mitchell explained this to her on April 10th, his last evening at the hospital before the detachment moved out. She listened without comment, her expression neutral. She understood the realities of military medicine. Patients got moved based on operational necessity, not medical ideals. She was lucky to have gotten the surgery at all. Lucky to have survived. Lucky to be recovering in relative comfort rather than dying in a collapsed building. "Thank you again," she said when he finished. "For everything. Mitchell felt awkward accepting gratitude for doing his job. He'd treated her the same way he'd treat any critically wounded patient. The fact that she was German, was a prisoner, was the enemy hadn't entered his medical decision-making. Wounded people needed treatment. He was a surgeon. He treated them. "You're a good nurse," he said finally. "The soldiers you cared for were lucky to have you." It was the truth. He'd seen her work during those initial surgeries before the collapse. She was competent, professional, dedicated. In another context, in another war, she'd have been a valued colleague. Instead, she was a prisoner who'd soon disappear into the POW system, one more German among millions. Her individual story lost in the chaos of Germany's collapse. Keller smiled slightly. "And they were lucky you were here when the building fell." Mitchell didn't know how to respond to that. He'd saved her life, yes, but he'd also been part of the army that was destroying her country, killing her people, ending the regime she'd served. The complexity of their situation, enemy and patient, conqueror and caretaker, was too tangled to address in a brief conversation. He settled for a simple acknowledgement. "Take care of yourself. Follow the post-operative instructions. Don't push your recovery too fast. Medical advice: professional, neutral, safe." He left the next morning before dawn, his detachment moving out as the first light touched the hills around Hadamar. The rear element would handle the final patient transfers. Mitchell's job was to move forward, establish the new aid station, prepare for the next wave of casualties. As his jeep drove through the town, passing shuttered buildings and wary civilians, Mitchell found himself thinking about Keller, about the strange circumstances that had put an American surgeon and a German nurse in the same operating room, working to save German lives, about the 4 hours he'd spent operating on her, treating her with the same care he'd give to his own sister if she'd been the one injured. War created these paradoxes, made enemies of people who would have been colleagues in peacetime, required soldiers to kill each other while medics and nurses tried to save them, drew absolute lines between sides, while individual humans blurred those lines constantly through small acts of humanity and professional dedication. Mitchell didn't have answers to those contradictions. He was a surgeon, not a philosopher. His job was to save lives when he could, accept losses when he couldn't, and not think too deeply about the larger meaning of it all. But he'd remember Keller. Remember her professionalism under fire. Remember her concern for her patients even as she lay dying. Remember her whispered request. "Don't let them see me like this." A plea for dignity in circumstances that offered none. He'd granted that request, had operated in private, away from watching eyes, had saved her life while preserving her professional distance from the men she'd cared for. It was a small thing, a minor consideration in the vast machinery of war. But it had mattered to her, so Mitchell had made it matter. The Third Army's advance continued. Mitchell's detachment established their new aid station, treated casualties from the fighting still occurring in isolated pockets, and watched as Germany collapsed around them. By mid-April, they were treating more prisoners than Americans. By late April, the war in Europe was clearly in its final days. Mitchell never saw Keller again. She was transferred to the Frankfurt hospital as planned, completed her recovery there, and was eventually processed through the POW system like millions of other Germans. Her fate after that, whether she survived the chaos of post-war Germany, whether she returned to nursing, whether she ever told anyone about the American surgeon who'd saved her life, Mitchell never learned. In the vast accounting of World War II, their brief intersection was statistically insignificant. One German nurse, one American surgeon, one surgery among millions of medical procedures performed during the war. Not a battle, not a campaign, not a moment that changed history or affected the war's outcome. But for Keller, it was the difference between life and death. For Mitchell, it was a reminder that professional duty transcended national loyalty. And for both of them, it was evidence that even in the machinery of total war, individual humanity could still assert itself in small, significant ways. The war ended 3 weeks later. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. The Third Army stopped advancing and began the long process of occupation. Mitchell's medical detachment transitioned from treating combat casualties to managing disease and injury among occupation troops. The immediate crisis was over. The desperate surgery sessions, the triage decisions, the constant stream of wounded, all of it slowed and then stopped. Mitchell found himself with time to reflect on the previous 18 months, on the hundreds of surgeries he'd performed, on the men he'd saved and the men he'd lost. Keller was part of those memories. Not a major part, not a defining moment, but present nonetheless. The German nurse, who'd worked efficiently alongside him, who'd been injured in a building collapse, who'd asked him for dignity in her dying moments, who'd survived because he'd spent 4 hours in an improvised operating room doing what he'd been trained to do. Years later, when people asked Mitchell about his war experiences, he rarely mentioned Keller. The story didn't fit easily into conventional narratives about World War II. Americans were supposed to fight Germans, not save them. Enemies were supposed to remain enemies, not become patients, whose lives you valued as much as your own troops. But in the quiet moments, when he thought about what the war had taught him about medicine and humanity, Keller's case came to mind. It represented something important about the role of medical personnel in war, about maintaining professional standards regardless of circumstances, about recognizing the humanity in everyone who needed care, regardless of which uniform they wore. Mitchell had entered the war as a competent surgeon. He'd emerged as something more, a doctor who'd learned that healing transcended politics, that medical ethics applied to everyone, that the Hippocratic Oath didn't recognize national boundaries. War had tried to make him see Germans as enemies to be killed. His profession had demanded he see them as patients to be saved. In Keller's case, his profession had won. The final irony was that Mitchell never learned what became of her, never knew if she survived the immediate post-war chaos, never knew if she returned to nursing, never knew if she ever thought about the American surgeon who'd saved her life while her country collapsed around her. Perhaps that was appropriate. War brought people together in intense, brief encounters, then scattered them back into their separate lives. Soldiers fought alongside comrades they'd never see again after demobilization. Medics treated patients who disappeared into evacuation chains. Nurses cared for wounded who either died or recovered and moved on. Keller and Mitchell's intersection was one of millions of such brief connections created and dissolved by war. Two professionals, doing their jobs, caught in circumstances neither had chosen. For a few days, their lives overlapped. Then the war's machinery pulled them apart, sent them to different fates, erased even the possibility of knowing what had become of each other. But the surgery remained. 4 hours in an improvised operating room, an American surgeon and a dying German nurse. Wounds repaired, life saved, dignity preserved. A small moment of medical professionalism amid the chaos of total war. Mitchell carried the memory of it for the rest of his life, not as a war story to impress people, not as an example of heroism or sacrifice, but as a reminder that even in war's worst circumstances, it was possible to act with skill and humanity, possible to see the individual person beyond the enemy uniform, possible to do your job with care and dedication, regardless of whose life you were saving. That was what war had taught him. That was what Keller's case had demonstrated. That was what he remembered when he thought about April 7th, 1945, and the German nurse who'd whispered, "Don't let them see me like this," as she lay bleeding in a canvas tent. He'd honoured that request, had saved her life, had maintained both his standards and hers. In the vast machinery of World War II, it was a trivial accomplishment. But to Mitchell, to Keller, to the handful of people who witnessed it, the moment mattered. Because in war, the small human moments are sometimes the only things that make the larger horror bearable. The brief connections, the professional courtesies, the recognition that enemy soldiers are still human beings who bleed and suffer and die like anyone else. War tried to erase those recognitions. Medicine insisted on maintaining them. Mitchell had maintained them, had treated Keller as a patient, not as a German, had given her the same care he'd give anyone, had proved to himself that his professional ethics could survive even total war. That was worth remembering. That was worth carrying forward. That was what made the difference between being a surgeon who happened to serve in war and being a war surgeon who never forgot he was still a doctor first. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.